From the West Coast, good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Porras, and I'm the Senior Manager for Education and Outreach at CAQH Core. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our webinar on the new Phase 4 CAQH Core operating rules. This webinar will provide a general overview of the rules and as well as resources and tools that are available to you. It's the first of a series of webinars on these rules. And eventually, in the next few months, we'll actually start to drill down on some of the specifics of the various rules. Before we begin, I'd like to mention a few logistical items. Later this afternoon, probably about an hour after the end of the webinar, you'll be able to download a copy of today's presentation from the CAQH Core website. And to do that, please navigate to the Core pull-down menu at the top of the CAQH.org welcome screen and select the Core Education Events page. Once you're there, a link, go to the webinar and a link of the PDF version of the presentation can be found. So on this slide, you can see a screenshot of the attendee GoToWebinar dashboard. You should be able, you should see something that looks similar to this on the right side of your computer desktop. When joining today's session, it's possible you may have joined the audio portion of the webinar using your computer speakers by default. If possible, we would prefer that you join the webinar by audio, by webinar audio by telephone. In order to do this, please select the telephone audio button in the audio panel of your dashboard, and the dial-in information will be displayed. Make sure you enter your audio PIN, which is found under your dial-in information. We'll try to save as much time as possible at the end of our program in order to respond to your questions. We encourage you to submit your questions at any time during this webinar by typing them into the questions panel of the dashboard. And we do ask that when you submit your question, please identify the type of your organization so that we can better answer your question. Today we'll have several presentations from CAQH Core staff. First on the status of the Phase 4 CAQH operating rules, then on the scope of the Phase 4 CAQH Core operating rules with some focus on the Phase 4 connectivity rule. We'll also spend some time on Phase 4 certification and when that test suite will be available. And finally, we'll share some resources and additional information that we hope will help you during your planning and implementation. We're covering a lot of ground today, so we hope we're going to be able to leave you with some good information and some tools. We'll begin today's program with an update on Phase 4 CAQH Core operating rules by CAQH Core Senior Manager Erin Richter-Weber. Erin?
Thanks, Jessica. I'm going to give a brief update on the status of the Phase 4 operating rules, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Bob Bowman, who's going to get into the detailed requirements within the rules. So can we move to the next slide? As I'm sure everyone on the phone is aware, the Affordable Care Act mandated the concept of operating rules in 3 phases. The first set of operating rules in the Affordable Care Act address health plan eligibility and claim status transactions. HIPAA-covered entities were required to implement these rules back on January 1, 2013, so they are being used in the marketplace today. The next set of operating rules included in Section 1104 of the ACA were the EFT and ERA operating rules. Those rules were implemented as of January 1, 2015 in the industry, and maintenance on those rules is now being conducted. The next item that's included in the ACA is a requirement that health plans certify their compliance with the operating rules and the underlying standards. The implementation date for this is TBD. HHS did put out an NPRM a while back and collected comments, but no final rule has been issued yet. So the timeline for this is still a bit unknown. Hopefully we'll have more information in the next year. Finally, the last set of ACA mandated operating rules are to address 5 different transactions: healthcare claims, prior authorization, enrollment, disenrollment, health plan premium payments, and healthcare claim attachments, for which HHS has not yet issued a standard. The Phase 4 CAQH Core operating rules address the first 4 transactions I mentioned, and they have been approved by the core participants for voluntary implementation within the industry. Our next slide will talk about some of the steps now that the core process is over that will occur via the regulatory process. So a quick reminder of what the core process was. The core participating organizations, 140 organizations, participated in subgroups and work groups to develop the draft rules. And the next step was a formal voting process through CAQH participating organizations. So all organizations that implement and create and use the transactions participated in this formal vote. 90% of the core participating organizations participated in the vote, and there was an 88% approval of the draft rules. So that was both great participation and overwhelming support. The final step on the core side is a review by the CAQH Core Multi-Stakeholder Board, which the board provided unanimous approval on the Phase 4 rules. Now that that process was completed back in September, CAQH Core will be updating NCBHS on the status of the Phase 4 operating rules via a letter. Once NCBHS is updated, they may make a recommendation on adoption to the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. In the third step, HHS may then publish a regulation in the Federal Register once it determines what components of the Phase 4 operating rules might be appropriate for federal mandate. Then there would be a public comment period where entities can submit comments on the operating rules to CMS and HHS. And finally, then, based on the public comments, the industry will be required to implement the operating rules, which is typically within 2 years of publication of a final regulation. So if you do the math here with the comment period, with the final regulation, and then the two years after a regulation, we're a couple years out at this point from a mandated implementation deadline for any Phase 4 operating rules that might be adopted. Next slide, please. That said, there's nothing that precludes entities from getting a head start and implementing the voluntary set of Phase 4 CAQH Core operating rules now. There are 4 infrastructure rules and 1 connectivity rule. There's an infrastructure rule for each of the 4 transactions I previously mentioned, and then the connectivity rule applies to all 4 transactions. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Bob Bowman, who's going to walk through some of the specifics of these rules with you. Bob?
Great. Thanks, Erin. And good afternoon. Just as Erin mentioned, we do want to walk through the scope of the 5 rules that are in this set of operating rules. And on this slide, you see a table that lists basically all of the infrastructure requirements there on your left with the 4 transactions across the top and where those particular requirements may fall for those particular transactions. We will walk through the infrastructure requirements kind of a little more in detail in just a moment, but I do want to draw your attention that for these 4 transactions, batch is required generally for claims, enrollment, and premium payment, and real-time is an optional requirement. So if you conduct those transactions in real-time, then those particular requirements related to real-time would then be applicable. For prior authorization, entities must choose to support that transaction in batch or real-time. So again, you have your option there for the 278 or the prior authorization transaction. As you can see, there's a standard set of infrastructure requirements for all the transactions, with some general or other category for some of those transactions that are business specific to those transactions. We can walk through some of those requirements as well. So on the next slide, you'll see that we want to focus in on some of the general concepts and themes for the Phase 4 operating rule set for these 4 transactions. Generally, we do establish a common method of connectivity or a safe harbor for the transactions. Again, we're conducting these transactions electronically, and connectivity is vitally important. We also have a minimum requirement of the system availability so that submitters know that the health plan is open and ready for business to conduct the transactions nearly 90% of the time in any given week. So we'll see some of those specific requirements in just a moment. Also, we have acknowledgments. Acknowledgments are very important so that your trading partners know that you have received their transactions, that they're not falling into a black hole. So the acknowledgement requirements are going to be specific around the transactions, and again, very important. Response times for those acknowledgments are equally important, so that entities know within a certain amount of time that the acknowledgments are coming their way. They know that their transactions that they submitted to the health plan are going to be received and are going to be acknowledged, and they know approximately when. Again, that importance of the roles and responsibilities for each of the, both between the submitters and the health plans, are going to be very important. We also address consistency when it comes to format for a companion guide, for a health plan's companion guide. So if you publish a companion guide for any of the transactions, then you'll follow a consistent flow and format for the data, making it much easier for your trading partner community to consume those companion guides. Again, it's the hope of the rules, as we've seen through the previous phases in 1, 2, and 3, and now in phase 4, to really increase the consistency and automation and the conduct of the transactions across all entities within this industry and this environment. Again, we are trying to increase the usage of the transactions. Right? We still want to get, if claims are only at 92%, there's no reason why we can't get them to 95% or 97%. So it might be a bad example with claims, but the other transactions all can use an increase in their usage throughout the industry. Again, other types of improvements that we're trying to make is make it much more simpler and easier, more efficient to conduct the transactions, to reduce administrative costs, improve customer service for both your patients and providers, less provider phone calls into the health plan, for example, and also to enhance the revenue cycle management, resulting in improved cash flow. So moving into some of the more detailed requirements on the next slide, for the batch processing low response time requirement. Again, if you're going to conduct transactions in batch, and again, batch is required for the 837, the 834, and the 820 transaction, with batch or real-time required for the 278. If an entity submits the transaction or the batch of transactions before 9 p.m. on any business day, a response must be made available by 7 a.m. the next morning for claims and the 278. For the 834 and 820, because of the specific business requirements for these transactions, those are not the next business day, but the third business day. So you can look at the detail requirements and the rules themselves, but we do want you to take away from today that there are specific requirements around the batch response time. On the next slide, we also have specific requirements around real-time processing no response times. If you conduct the transactions in real time, and probably the most applicable for this rule would be the 278 transaction. If you conduct that transaction in real time, a provider would submit the transaction and receive a response within 20 seconds. So that is the round-trip maximum response time requirement for a real-time transaction. Moving on to the next slide is the batch acknowledgement requirements. So similar to real-time, we also, in supporting batch, there are requirements specific around the acknowledgements. And generally, for all 4 of the transactions in this rule set, the 999 is used to acknowledge the receipt of a functional group. And that is either to acknowledge the acceptance of it, accepted with errors, or reject that transaction, that batch transaction. Additionally, for the 837 transaction, it is a requirement in this set, in this phase, to also conduct the 277 claim acknowledgement transaction for both, or for all 3 837 types, the institutional claim, the professional claim, and the dental claim. So generally, again, for batch acknowledgements, there are requirements for all 4 transactions for the conduct of the 999, as well as the 277 CA for the 837 claims. On the next slide, we also have real-time acknowledgement requirements. So if you conduct these transactions, again, in real time, you must also acknowledge them in real time. And here, again, generally for all 4 transactions, the use of the 999 is used to indicate if a functional group is being rejected. Also for the 837, similar to batch, we also have the requirement for the 277 claims acknowledgement transaction to acknowledge that the functional group has been accepted or accepted with errors. So again, it's similar to batch, but again, as a real-time, as we're conducting the transactions in real time, there are specific requirements of how to use the 999 and the 277 CA in that type of environment. And again, today, it may be more applicable to the 278 transaction. Many people do conduct that transaction in real time, whereas they may not conduct the 837, the 834, and the 820 in real time yet, right? As we do want to make this progressive and build upon each other from phase to phase. There's no reason why entities could not implement real-time 837, 834, and 820 transactions. And if you do, we have requirements already set for you. On the next slide, we do have requirements, as Aaron mentioned, for the fifth rule, the connectivity rule. And the connectivity rule and security requirements are very specific and different than what they are in phase 2. So we'll provide just a general overview now and talk more specifically about those individual specific requirements for phase 4 in just a minute. But the rule is applicable to these specific transactions, the 837, the 278, the 834, and the 820, not the previous transaction. So there's a division or divide between how you will conduct the transactions from the previous phases to this phase, because these rules are specific to these transactions. We do, similar to the previous phases, have transport layer security, a single message envelope structure rather than two, a single submitter authentication method, normative message envelope metadata, specific standard core schema and a web service description, transaction-specific required optional processing modes, the standard payload type identifiers, as well as the process for maintaining the process modes and the payload type identifiers. So all of that is contained within the connectivity requirements and the connectivity rule. As regards our safe harbor, this does enable trading partners to use different communication methods and security methods that you may already have in place today. So there are no requirements to unplug and dismantle your connections that you have today with your trading partners. The requirement is that you must support the minimum requirement in phase 4 for connectivity. So you have to open up this gateway, this pathway for your trading partners. So again, you don't have to unplug anything. You just have to ensure that this gateway is open for these transactions for your trading partners. And if they wish to conduct that and make that wish known to you, then you have to open that up for your trading partners. Moving on to the next slide, as I mentioned earlier, we do have requirements around system availability. And this requires that the system is up and available for the conduct of the transactions 86% of the time per calendar week. You also have very specific requirements about reporting when you're down. So you may take non-routine downtime. You may take scheduled downtime. You may have emergency downtime. Any of those types of downtime or system availability edits or changes within your system, you need to let your trading partner and your community know. So there are specific publication requirements around when those are to be scheduled and how they are published and how you notify your trading partners. Moving on to our companion guide requirements. Again, very specifically that if you publish a companion guide, then you must follow the flow and format of the companion guide master template. And this template does specify very specific sections, as you can see detailed in the table in the center, around exactly what must appear in the master companion guide template and what you will be writing your companion guide to include. Again, this is a requirement for all 4 of the transactions. So that might be something a little bit new for those entities that conduct 834 and 820. If you're a health plan and receive those transactions, you would also be required, if you publish a companion guide, to use the master companion guide template. With that, I'll hand the call over to Drew to conduct our first polling question.
Great. Thank you very much, Bob. And this brings us to our first of 2 polls that we have during today's webinar. I will read the question and then I will launch the poll, which you can then answer directly on your screen. So today's poll is, please indicate whether your organization intends to voluntarily implement the Phase 4 CAQH core operating rules. I will launch the poll and then we will pause for about a brief 20 seconds while you are able to answer. We'll hold for another 10 seconds. One more second, and I'll close the poll. And I will share the results with the group. And so it seems to be that the majority, 41%, need to learn more. And it's good that you are joining us on this webinar, and we'll have more of these in the future. And we surely hope that you find it informative. And then the other largest percentage was 27% indicated that, yes, they were planning on implementing all of them. And still, we hope that you also find this helpful as you go down that path. So we'll carry on, and I will pass it back over to Bob.
Great, thanks, Drew. On the next slide, you can see that we have built in our process from phase 1, 2, 3, and now to phase 4, that the way that we've constructed the connectivity rule to be progressive through time, so beginning way back in 2006, all the way up to today with phase 4, that we've taken an approach that really does build on one phase to the next. And it's a progressive approach in that we try to ensure that the requirements that we're building into the connectivity rule and the safe harbor requirements change specifically to meet the business needs of not only our industry but also of the security requirements that are becoming more and more a focus for the healthcare industry. So as you can see, for example, just in phase 2, there were very specific message metadata requirements. There were 2 message envelope standards, 2 submitter authentication standards, for example. And now, as we've done a lot of learning and a lot of industry implementation over the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've migrated now to, with phase 4, onto a convergence of a single message envelope standard, a single submitter authentication standard. We've learned a lot through the implementation of the phase 2 rules for eligibility, claim status. And then moving into phase 4 with the transactions that are to be built around this level for the claim, the prior authorization, the enrollment, and the premium payments, we'll be implementing this level of connectivity with these transactions. Now, maybe to break this down a little bit more on the next slide, you can see that as we develop from one phase to the next, we go through a very specific process. This developmental rule process, we take an environmental scan of all of the major healthcare IT initiatives that are going on, all of the trends and all of the potential opportunities. We also look, very important, at the implementer feedback from all of the previous phases. All of that goes through an entire process where we prioritize each of these particular opportunity areas using our guiding principles, using our business criteria, and using the technical criteria. And then we select very specifically, and as the core body does very judiciously, they select and develop rule requirements around those opportunities. So, for example, the use of the SOAP enveloping standards for data exchange was the group gravitated towards that particular method for phase 4. Also, the use of the X509 digital certificates. Again, we wanted to increase our emphasis on security, so moving to digital certificates only and removing username password was part of the requirements for phase 4, as well as using the SSL level version 3 and the movement to TLS 1.1 and higher as a requirement, again, for that emphasis on security. So again, building on our guiding principles and our criteria, new requirements came out for phase 4. We then go through the process of drafting the rule requirements and going through an iterative approach with the work group as they develop that rule. So there's a complete review and approval process for the draft rule before the final rule is voted on by the all-core member vote, and the core board weighs in on that vote as well, just as Aaron mentioned earlier. So the entire process took place for phase 4 as it did for phase 3, phase 2, and phase 1. So that's why we've been able to refine the requirements for the connectivity rule, in particular around the connectivity and the security requirements very specifically for this rule. And that's why we saw some changes from Phase 2 to Phase 4. Some of the key features of the Phase 4 rule include, again, we've had to address the implementer feedback to improve clarity of the rule. And so you'll see that the rule is hopefully much easier for your technical staff to implement because it's much easier to read. It has better examples. We've moved the payload type tables into separate documents that allows it to be maintained much easier. We've increased the transport security significantly. We've simplified the interoperability. Again, we've converged onto a single enveloping and authentication standard. So instead of implementing 2, as you did for Phase 1 and 2 and 3, you only have to implement 1 of them. Again, we've included additional message interactions for the new transactions that are part of Phase 4. Again, that extra transaction support includes premium payments, claims, prior auth, and benefit enrollments. All of this, again, remember that the safe harbor rule allows entities to build the minimum requirements for the new transactions, but there also allows you to build this for your existing transactions for eligibility, claim status, and your remittance advice. Again, the safe harbor allows for you to go ahead and start taking those steps to converge everything into this single connectivity rule support. On the next slide, this gives a lot of detail, and I won't go into much of it one by one, but we do want to highlight that from Phase 2, which many of you are very familiar with as you've implemented Phase 2 for your eligibility, claim status, and the 835 transaction, your remittance device transaction, probably most recently. There are changes. We do highlight those changes with our star here, so you can see where there have been revisions. Again, specifically around digital certificates, we've removed the requirement for username and password. We have real-time batch generic push and pull interactions, particularly because of the conduct of the 834 and the 820 transactions. So it's very important to have these push-pull interactions. So you'll see those within the rule itself. You'll also see that we removed the My Multi-Part requirement for Phase 4, so only for these 4 transactions would you have to implement the SOAP WSDL. And also for the secure socket layers, we're very more specific around the level that's required. So we moved to SSL version 3.0 as well as TLS 1.0 or higher. Again, maximizing and moving to that higher security level. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of the differences between Phase 2 connectivity and Phase 4 connectivity. And again, we'll have lots of times for questions. But now we're going to move over to our next polling question. So Drew, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Bob. And this brings us to our second and final polling question of the webinar. And just like last time, I will read the question and launch the poll, and we'll pause for everyone to respond. So this poll asks, which of the following would you consider to be the biggest challenge to your organization's implementation of the Phase 4 CAQH Core operating rules? And I will launch the poll. Stand by. And we will pause here for everyone to respond. We'll wait about another 10 seconds. Take about 3 more seconds. I will close the poll and share the results with everybody. 43% indicated that overcoming resource constraints, and this would be things like time, staff, internal expertise, etc. 33% indicated that they need to learn more to fully understand the Phase 4 CAQH Core operating rules. And the reason we're asking this question is because this will help the Education and Outreach Department know which types of resources would be most beneficial to you. So we like to ask this question from time to time, particularly on Phase 4. And so this will help us help you understand Phase 4 and how best to implement. And with that, I will carry on with the webinar here. And please let me introduce the CAQH Core Senior Manager, Matthew Albright. And he will walk us through Phase 4 Core certification and when the test suite will be available. Matthew, go ahead.
Thank you, Drew. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And we'll go right to the next slide. As some of you may be aware, a document called the Certification Test Suite has been developed for each of the CAQH core operating rule phases. Each of these test suites has a list of the requirements or test scripts that entities must pass in order to become core certified. So for each phase, our core authorized testing vendor or vendors take the certification test suite and build a testing platform. On this testing platform, an entity can complete a series of testing tasks that then align with the requirements in the certification test suite. What makes core certification unique in terms of industry certification is the fact that for each core operating rule, industry creates the specific test that must be passed in order to be considered conformant. Industry representatives in the core participating organizations develop and vote on these test suites and the test scripts alongside the operating rules. So we heard Bob and Aaron talk about how the operating rules that Bob went over were developed and voted on by the participating organizations. Side by side with those operating rules, the participating organizations also considered the core certification test suite for phase 4. In essence, this means that industry is defining specifically what conformance with the operating rules means. And this is why core certification is considered the gold standard. You can think of the process as a kind of dual approach. On the one hand, while core participating organizations were developing and voting on the phase 4 operating rules, they were also thinking about how a health plan or entity would be able to prove that they were conformant with the rules. And thus, they developed the core certification test scripts. Next slide, please. So the core authorized testing vendor NFX is currently developing a testing platform that will test for phase 4 core certification. We expect that that will be ready to be rolled out to the public in mid to late summer of this year. So please take a look at the certification test suite. It's available, of course, for free on our website today. In the meantime, however, we will be testing the system this spring. So if you want to be an early adopter of the phase 4 core operating rules and be among the first to be core certified in phase 4, then come join us as a beta tester of the testing platform. Remember, the core certification is not just for HIPAA-covered entities. Vendor products and solutions can be certified too, and we're looking for all categories of companies to be beta testers. If you're interested, contact us at the email at the bottom of the page. And do you feel like you're now in a Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney movie? Come on, let's put on a show. I'll turn it back over to Aaron, who will be describing some of the resources and additional implementation infos and tools. Aaron? All
right, thanks, Matthew. And obviously, Matthew is very excited about certification opportunities. And I want to kind of build on what he's saying. There's a lot of reasons why you should begin thinking about implementing the phase 4 voluntary operating rules now. We've done a lot of work on infrastructure requirements as an industry with eligibility, claim status, and electronic remittance advice. These rules, as Bob described, really build on those investments that you have made. It'll help you build the ROI of those investments across all of the HIPAA-mandated transactions. Starting early also allows your organization to determine your own timeline rather than a mandated one. Right now, we don't know what that mandated date might be, but if you start now, no doubt you'll have plenty of time rather than working up against a hard deadline. It also demonstrates your organization's commitment to administrative simplification and establishes your organization's leadership in the industry as an early adopter. As Matthew mentioned, we are always looking for early adopters and beta testers to help us move through the certification process and also identify where we might need to build out FAQs and tools for the industry as more begin implementing these rules. Next slide, please. So as this is really the third set of operating rules the industry has implemented, we have a lot of lessons learned from previous phases at each step of the implementation process. If you're just getting started with which no doubt with the phase 4 rules everyone is, education is key. You need to understand your organization's business processes and how the operating rules impact that. Get executive buy-in early. That makes it easier to get budget approval, etc., knowing this is coming down the pike. Then begin your analysis and planning. Think about the scope of your project. Identify those departments, processes, and systems that will be impacted, and treat it like any major business project. As you move into system design and implementation and testing, remember to engage your trading partners early and often. They may have very critical roles in the process, and you want to make sure they're aware that they may need to coordinate with you, build budget out for this as well. Once you've implemented, test, test, test. Make sure you're compliant with your trading partners and your clients. And then once we move into maintenance, continue to stay involved with CAQH Core, working on maintenance and staying up to date on any implementation developments. Next slide, please. The good news is we have a number of tools ready to help you no matter where you are in the process. In phase 4, like I said, most of you are just getting started. Just yesterday, we published the phase 4 analysis and planning guide. Many of you may be familiar with this tool from the previous phases of CORE, and I'll talk more in detail about its components later, but it really helps you start thinking about what is going to be the impact to your organization of implementing the operating rules. We are working hard on a set of phase 4 FAQs, which will be posted early next year, as well as the voluntary core certification, which Matthew mentioned, hopefully will be coming out next summer. Next slide. So the first step when you're thinking about where should I start in this process, read the rules. And don't just read section 4 of the rule requirements, read section 1 and section 2, which give the background and the business case for why these rules have been implemented and adopted and the impact they might have on your organization. They're all free and available on our website at the links here. Next slide. Once you're familiar with the rules, I encourage you then to take a look at the newly published analysis and planning guide for phase 4. This guide will help you understand the applicability of the rules to your organization's systems and processes. It'll help you identify both internal and external systems, things that you may have outsourced to vendors that will process these transactions. It includes some really great tools to help you identify where you may have gaps. There's a stakeholder and business type evaluation, a system inventory and impact assessment worksheet, and a gap analysis worksheet. And this worksheet is really critical. It lists out the rule requirements step one at a time so you can really consider for each requirement what systems are impacted and what types of remediation might you need to do. Next slide. So I'm not going to get into detail here because I just talked about it, but this really calls out some of the value of the tools that are built into the analysis and planning guide. First you need to understand what aspects of your business are implemented using the stakeholder and business type evaluation. Then think specifically about the systems and the products that are implemented, and then bring it down to the detailed requirement level in the gap analysis. Next slide. In addition to the analysis and planning guide, as with previous phases, in the next few months we'll be rolling out additional tools. So we have the analysis and planning guide. We have a website that is dedicated to phase 4. We'll be rolling out a set of FAQs. We'll be holding more webinars on the phase 4 rules and drilling down into more detail, and ultimately including implementers of those rules as well. We're looking at creating a set of additional unique tools to assist specifically with this phase of operating rules. And as always, staff experts are available to answer your questions. You can email core@caqh.org to either set up a call or just ask a quick question if you can't find what you need in the FAQs or elsewhere. Also, if you have ideas for tools you'd like to see from CAQH Core, let us know. Email core@caqh.org. Next slide. With that, I will turn it back over to Jessica for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Erin. So I think we have a good amount of time to answer your questions, and thanks to those of you that have already submitted some questions. If you have not yet submitted and would like to, please type them into the questions panel on your dashboard. And again, please identify your type of organization so we can better respond to your questions. I'm going to start with a question that I believe is for Bob. The question is, why is there variability in elapsed time between the four Phase 4 CAQH core infrastructure rules?
Thanks, Jessica. The elapsed time requirement between the 837, the 278, the 834, and the 820 do vary because there are very specific business uses for those transactions. So the claim, for example, is submitted and it has to be responded to, acknowledged much sooner, for example, for batch than in 834 and 820, particularly because the 834 files that a health plan may receive can be much, much larger than a batch of claims. There's many members, member data could be part of that 834 transaction. So when the core subgroup and rules work group built the rules and drafted the requirements, they looked at the variability of the conduct of the transactions and the business uses of the transactions to make sure that the requirements were specific to that use and what is the best way that the industry conducts the transactions. So there is variability between some of the requirements from one transaction to the next. Those are detailed specifically in the rule, as well as the planning and analysis guide that Erin mentioned. So if you use that tool as your basis for your gap analysis, you'll make sure that you'll see the difference and can weigh that specifically for how you may have to remediate your system or systems and applications for each of those transactions.
Thank you, Bob. The next question, I believe, is for Erin. The question is, can you confirm that my HIPAA-covered organization does not need to implement the Phase 4 rules by January 1st, 2016, which is the date specified in Section 1104 of the Affordable Care Act?
Yes, Jessica, I can confirm that. As I mentioned before, while that date is specified in Section 1104 of the ACA for operating rules addressing those last 5 transactions, there has not been any regulation yet put forth by the Department of Health and Human Services that actually mandates a set of operating rules. So the Phase 4 rules, with which CORE just finished, address 4 of those transactions and have been shared with NCBHS, but we are still waiting to hear from HHS and CMS about any sort of regulation. So it's a little bit TBD as to that timeline, but we don't anticipate an implementation date for a couple more years.
Thank you, Erin. And the next question looks like it's for Matthew. The question is, what will be required for Phase 4 certification? Will attestation be required, and when?
So I'll answer this in 2 responses, because the question could probably refer to 2 different certifications. So let me say for the Phase 4 core certification, which we emphasize is voluntary at this point, and certainly will be voluntary when it rolls out at the end of the summer. For that, I would point to, in terms of requirements, I would point to the certification test suite that I referred to before, and you can find that link on our website, and that will have very specific lists of test scripts that entities must meet to be core certified. But it could be that this question is referring to the Affordable Care Act's mandate that all health plans certify with HHS that they are conducting these transactions according to the standards and operating rules. And so I'll respond to that in 2 ways as well. The Affordable Care Act does indeed say that all health plans must be certified or certify compliance with all the transactions for the standards and the operating rules for each of the transactions. However, there's a number of things that have to happen before we find out when and what exactly the requirements will be from a regulatory perspective. So again, the ACA mandates it, but we haven't heard from HHS or CMS any terms of timelines or anything else. And just to put it into perspective, Erin talked a little bit about what needs to happen before these operating rules, these phase 4 operating rules, are mandated. And she said maybe a couple of years before we see a mandate or a compliance date. And so then you can probably assume that it'll be a couple years after that before we see a regulation that specifies what would be necessary for health plans to certify that they're compliant to HHS with phase 4. So hopefully that was understandable. One is the voluntary core certification, and the other one's the mandate that's come down from the Affordable Care Act.
Thanks, Matthew. The next question, I believe, is another one for Bob. The question is, why do the phase 4 CAQH core operating rules not address any data content of the transaction?
That's a great question, because it's definitely different than what we've done in phase 2 and phase 3, where we did address data content. In phase 4, we specifically did not address data content requirements because the industry, as through our environmental scans and our polling and our discussions through the subgroups and the work groups, all led the core body to not approach data content at this time for these transactions. It is something that we will probably consider and probably work on for a future rule set, but the core body that reviewed, and similar to how we discussed the connectivity rule earlier, where we go through an entire process before we develop a draft rule, we use that exact same process for all of the rules that we develop. So in looking at exactly where the industry was when we drafted the rules and where they wanted to go, they decided to address, and we decided to address very specifically the infrastructure requirements, really to lay down the tracks for the train, and then in the future we'll be able to build upon that and add in the data content for the transactions. So probably as early as 2016, we'll be looking at different initiatives that may address data content requirements for some of these transactions.
Thank you very much, Bob. The next question, I think, is another one for Aaron. And the question is, when will electronic attachments, in other words, the 275, be addressed? Aaron, you might be on mute.
I am on mute. Thank you. As of right now, HHS has not adopted a standard for attachments. And so the operating rule development for that has been placed on hold. That said, CAQH Core is committed to conducting a pilot in 2016 looking at the use of attachments. So definitely trying to get some lessons learned to inform where operating rules might be valuable for this particular transaction. In terms of a standard, if you think about what I said about the adoption of the phase 4 operating rules, it's a similar process via the regulatory process. So again, we're looking at a couple years before any sort of implementation date would be out for any attachment standards.
Thanks so much. The next question, I think it might be one for Bob, is the question is, if a covered entity, a provider, requests to submit prior authorizations electronically, are payers required to offer a 278?
That's a great question, and one that really isn't purview to CAQH necessarily, because this is a requirement under HIPAA and HIPAA regulations. So maybe better addressed to CMS. However, from our perspective, and probably what you'll get from CMS, is that each of these transactions is required to be conducted by a health plan if a covered entity requests to conduct the transaction. So in the question that was submitted online, the inquirer was wondering if a provider requests to submit a 278 electronically, must the health plan be able to do so? And my quick answer would be yes. The health plan would be required to accept a 278 that a provider wished to submit to them. That's a great question.
Thanks so much, Bob. The next question is for Matthew. The question is, what is the fee or fees to implement the phase 4 operating rule?
Good question, and I'll answer this kind of with 3 responses as well. First of all of the materials that Aaron talked about today, the operating rules themselves, all of that is free. You can find all of this on our website, and so there's no fee involved, certainly with CAQH Core, to actually implement the Phase 4 operating rules and use our rules and use our tools. The second question that may be implied is, how much does it cost to implement the Phase 4 operating rules? And certainly I would point to some of the tools that Aaron pointed to as well, the analysis and planning, the gap analysis, in order to figure out how much it would take for your systems to come in line with the Phase 4 operating rules. So that's a good way to kind of look at your systems and figure out what maybe your cost would be to your organization alone to implement it. And then I'll give a third answer to it. And the third answer to it, what might the fee be to get certified in Phase 4 operating rules? And our fees there are very similar to, well, they're exactly identical to what we're now charging for Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 3. For Phase 4 certification, you'll be paying either $4,000 or $6,000, $4,000 or $6,000 based on your annual revenue. So we've got a breakdown of at least the Phase 1, 2, and 3 costs for certification, but it's probably either $4,000 or $6,000. I'm sorry, 4,000 or, I'm sorry, I have that wrong, $6,000 or $8,000. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. The next question is for Bob. The question is, on the response time for the 837 transaction second business day following submission, does that mean the next morning after submission? Is there not a full 24-hour response time?
Good question. It is talk about specifically the requirements around the batch acknowledgement that's required for the transactions. So if you are conducting any of these transactions in batch, and many of you probably are today, that this particular requirement around when the response is required to be made available to the submitter. So basically, if the batch is submitted before 8 p.m. in the evening, the acknowledgement must be made available by 7 a.m. the next day. So you're right, it is less than 24 hours for the acknowledgement to be made available. Again, for the 837 and 278 is that next day, and for the 834, 820, you have 3 business days to make that available, because again, usually the size of those transactions can be much larger. But so there is a variance, but you're right, it is less than 24 hours for that acknowledgement for the claim to be made available.
Great, thanks so much. I think this is another one for you, Bob. The question is, will there be any changes to the 820 and 834 transactions, such as adding new fields, etc.?
And my response goes back to, or this question kind of talks about the data content within the transaction. And for Phase 4, we have no data content requirements for any of the transactions. So the rules will not address data, the fields, the length of fields, any required data around any of the transactions, be it a claim or the 834 transaction, just as an example. So no, we will not be addressing any data content for Phase 4.
Thanks so much, Bob. I believe the next question is for Matthew, I think. The question is, do all health plans have to be credentialed or certified?
Good question. And again, I'll respond kind of on 2 levels. The first level is that ACA mandate in the Affordable Care Act. It is mandated that all health plans must certify compliance with the standards and operating rules for these transactions, and there's a number of deadlines in the Affordable Care Act. So that's what the Affordable Care Act has said. The second part of that is, in terms of regulation, we have not had a final rule. So we've seen one proposed rule, but we have not had a final rule that has clarified, first of all, how health plans need to come in. If any of you have followed the health plan identifier, the HPID voyage over the last 2 years, you know that the HHS is starting to question or rethink or reanalyze the HPID construct. And that construct was a way of organizing health plans into, higher health plans, controlling health plans, and sub-health plans. That's being rethought. So that question about, do all health plans have to certify, it's unclear because the regulations haven't come out yet that clarify what they mean by all health plans. And so we might see some playing around with that with the rules. And again, with the final rule, we haven't seen any specificity about the documentation that's necessary. We've seen a proposed rule, but at this point, core certification is purely voluntary. So again, because we haven't seen a finalized rule, a final rule that specifies the documentation that's necessary to meet that ACA mandate, core certification we still consider voluntary. Last part of that is in the proposed rule that came out in 2014 about the certification of compliance rule. There were two options. One was the core certification, and the other one proposed was something called a credential. The credential CAQH core is put in charge of administering, but, and indeed we had industry draft and develop some forms that would go with that credential, but we are not processing that credential. We're not awarding that HIPAA credential because, again, it was a part of a proposed rule, and we haven't seen a final rule on that would put that credential into law. So again, sounds like all health plans have to get certified at some point, but we're not sure when and how just yet because we're waiting on regulations.
Thanks, Matthew. The next question is for Bob. The question is, the CAQH core have any intention of writing rules for the predetermination or 837I and 837P transactions? If so, is there a timeline for that work?
That's another interesting question because, again, it kind of goes back to the data content and how you are going to, what data would you include in the 837I, P, or D in the predetermination requirements, and what kind of response a health plan would have to those types of transactions when they receive them. So although we don't have requirements for data content yet in this set, we are looking next year to start down that path of looking probably specifically at the claims on what type of data content requirements that we should consider drafting rules for. So we'll be looking at opportunity areas, and this is definitely a big one for predetermination because, for example, the dental industry has this down pat. They do a really great job of conducting the 837D predetermination and receiving information about the type of response a health plan would have. The medical side of the world hasn't yet mastered that process, so this is something that could be a good potential or a good candidate for one of those opportunity areas. So nothing yet, but more to come next year. And we did receive a follow-up question around the conduct of the transactions. In the earlier question, it was all about the 278 transaction and why or how a health plan has to support that transaction. And really going all the way back to the original HIPAA Act in 1996, when we first implemented version 4010 in 2001, that really was when every health plan had to set up a system and a process to conduct all of the HIPAA required transactions. So every HIPAA transaction from the 837 to the 278 to the eligibility transactions to claim status, every health plan should be able to conduct those transactions today because those are required now for almost 2 decades. So every health plan has to be able to conduct those transactions. The caveat or the difference now is that we are going back and looking at the lack of adoption of the transactions in the industry because there was a lack of operating rules. And so from 2014, 2015, now to 2016, the industry through regulation has been forced to adopt the transactions with operating rules to make it much easier to conduct the transactions and move the industry to actually using the transactions. So although every health plan has to conduct the 278 and has had to do that for, again, 15 years now, there are now operating rules around the conduct of the 278 that are part of the voluntary rule set that we just published here in September that the regulators will consider for adoption as being mandated. So just to make sure there's a clean distinction, all of the HIPAA transactions are required to be conducted by the health plan if their trading partners request them. And one would assume that every provider would want to send in an electronic 278 or an eligibility transaction. So it's safe to assume that every health plan should implement, or by law have been required to implement, all of the HIPAA transactions to date. Now we're going back and adding in operating rules to make sure that it's much easier to conduct We're setting up a national network for connectivity to make it much, much, much easier, more efficient, and a lot cheaper to conduct the transactions. So hopefully that's good clarification or distinction for you. And I'll hand the call back over to Jessica.
Thanks so much. So we are just about out of time for today. I want to thank my colleagues at CAQH Core for these presentations. We hope that they were informative. We want to also thank our participants. Thank you for listening, for answering the polling questions, for engaging with your questions. I'm going to leave you with some takeaways, and I think the main thing I want you to take away from this slide is that we're here to help and be a resource to you. If we could go to the next slide, here are some future webinars, and I'd like to point out that in January we're going to have another Phase 4 webinar. It's going to be very similar to this one. Of course, we'd love to have you back, but also if there's any of your colleagues that would benefit from this webinar, please share. Send them an email or share our website with them because we'd like to educate as many people as possible. We also have other webinars on other topics, so please come back and join us. And then if we could go to the final slide, this is just a slide that gives you different ways that you can engage with CAQH Core, not just with webinars, but by accessing our resources, contacting us by phone or email. And that is all I've got for you today. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Have a good afternoon.